Today marks the International Memorial Day for Comfort Women, which remembers the pain and suffering endured by thousands of women and girls who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II. August 14th was the day when one of the late victims, Hak-soon, became the first former comfort woman to speak out publicly in 1991. The women have been demanding proper acknowledgement from the Japanese government for their pain, along with an heartfelt apology and an adequate redress, but Tokyo has been largely unresponsive. This does remain one of the biggest sticking points in South Korea-Japan relations, and we now zoom into this issue today with Dr. Elizabeth Son, Associate Professor of Northwestern University, who authored Embodied Reckonings, Comfort Women, Performance and Trans-Pacific Redress. We're also joined by Dr. Tomomi Yamaguchi, Associate Professor of Sociocultural Anthropology at Montana State University, and she's also the Director of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Programme. And last but not least, we have Dr. Nancy Snow, Distinguished Professor of Public Diplomacy at the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Well,
Thank you.
Well, let's start with you, Dr. Son. So the consequences of Japan's wartime sexual slavery didn't end with the country's surrender in World War II. The victims' entire lives have been affected. And also the sexual abuse of women in general today continues. And, well, how do these stories then speak to us today, and what should we learn from them?
These stories of comfort women survivors, first, they show to us the bravery of these women who endured unimaginable violence during the war and who chose when to come forward with their stories and how to be active in advocating and fighting for justice. They also show us that survivors of sexual violence will not be silenced and that their experiences during the war do not define who they are. These experiences are part of a multifaceted identity. And these stories also show to us the power of survivor leadership. These women have bravely gone around the world to share their stories and to fight for justice. And they continue to be an inspiration for survivors around the world.
And Dr. Yamaguchi, the same question goes to you, really. How does the comfort women issue resonate with women today?
Yes, the comfort women issue. I'm originally from Japan. I'm Japanese, and it really resonates. Many women in the world, because the wartime violence against women has been prevalent even after the World War II. And those survivor story, the comfort women story, has been really powerful. And their leadership and the movement to fight against wartime violence against women has been so impressive, and they are really the role models for all of us in the world.
And Dr. Yamaguchi, since the 1990s, when former comfort women began speaking out, they have been calling for a genuine apology and proper redress, but Tokyo has tried to close the matter with government deals, and they've opposed really any kind of acknowledgement of the issue, such as the installation of statues, for instance. And some far-right politicians, they've even branded the comfort women as prostitutes. Why do you think it's difficult for Japan's far-right or neo-nationalists to really consult with the victims, accept this as a human rights issue, and really have an open discussion about this?
Yeah, it's a combination of racism, sexism, and their kind of still ongoing colonial attitude. For the neo-nationalist perspective, I think they think that they have been engaging in open discussion about this from their perspective. But then they don't trust what the survivors say. They don't really believe in any historical studies that has been done by many scholars in the world. So they just are into their own way of thinking, and they really don't listen to others. And they are very confident that their stories are the most powerful ones in the world, not in Japan. because current Prime Minister Abe has been part of their movement.
And do you also think it might be due to the societal structure of Japanese society today, as well as its gender gap?
Oh, the sexism in Japan is still very prevalent. Feminist movement is there, but it's not as strong as it could have been. And the gender gap is really still bad in terms of women's representation in politics and women in the workplace, especially. But other issues such as violence against women, Japanese women have been struggling to get better treatment of them. And it's obviously relevant to the failure of the Japanese society to address the comfort women issue.
Now, Dr. Snow, the two governments, the South Korean government and the Japanese government, they can't seem to move forward in a constructive manner and actually resolve this issue and improve their relations. Do you think there is any way to resolve this in a non-political way as well?
Well, I'm an educator, and I would really start with the people and get away from the central governments. It's clear that, at least on the side of Japan, which I study regularly, and Abe's image and Japan's image in the world, that there are competing narratives about wartime history. And many of my Japanese students are not too aware. They've heard of comfort women. They know it as sort of a meme. They just, it's a thing that is always there and present, but they don't know the history. They haven't heard from these very strong women, these survivors. I like that point that Dr. Sohn made about survivor leadership. But for many of us too, we're a little reluctant to even try to raise our voices on this issue because we're so afraid of maybe saying the wrong thing and upsetting feelings. But we need to be able to be comfortable with this discomfort about this topic. Ironically, we're talking about comfort women, but there's so much discomfort in addressing this. And if you put it in a larger context, we're living in a global pandemic now where there is a lot of reluctance to really talk about fundamental human rights issues because of varied interests where there are competing power politics at play. So it makes it very difficult. I think you would need almost a full semester or two to address this and look at the whole landscape perspective on it.
Well, as you said, this really is a very critical human rights issue that still goes on to this day, but that's not how it's really been treated, even by politicians. They've taken a more transactional approach to it. And, well, with the 2015 agreement that was inked by Korea's previous administration, didn't include the victims in the negotiation process. And this caused the current administration to actually step back from the deal, as you might remember. And, well, Dr. Son, even the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination recommended that Japan takes a victim-oriented approach. And what do you think really is the best way to settle the issue, having met some of the victims yourself?
I think the best way to approach this issue is to begin with the survivors' demands and to understand what they are calling for, an official and sincere apology and reparations, and for the Japanese government to take full responsibility. They also are really calling for an expansive vision of redress that is not simply legal or political, but is also social and cultural. And so they're calling for public education, and they're also calling for memorialization. Now, one of the issues with the 2015 agreement between the governments of South Korea and Japan is that it was an effort to shut down public discourse at the international level, but also at the domestic level. And so I think we need to really first start with the survivors, their demands, and to really be mindful of how they have always been calling for an expansive vision of redress.
And Dr. Yamaguchi, what do you think would be the best way to actually resolve this issue? Because we failed so many times in the past.
I agree with Dr. Song that we should really start from the survivors' voices. And then the Japanese government has been ignoring their voices pretty much. But we really need to start from their voices, otherwise nothing will be resolved. And the education is the key. That Japanese history education doesn't really include much about this issue, and many of the young students, and actually older ones too, don't really know about this issue, even though the 1993 Cornell Statement still survives, and then it tells the need to educate people on this issue, to remember this issue. It hasn't happened in Japan.
As you said, education is so important, getting the facts out there. And even to this day, more and more facts are being revealed. I mean, records in China that are being revealed today, actually on Friday, contain accounts from Japanese soldiers that include testimonies that 30 Korean women were raped by 4,000 soldiers. Now, Dr. Snow, how do you think the world should really learn from this issue of gender-based violence and wartime abuse? And why is it so important, even in this day, to remember these atrocities of the past?
It's critical because we all have to recognize each other's dignity and respect across gender, across many different lines. And we've got to get beyond the blatant politics, the advantage that political leaders or different groups will use to sort of take advantage and exploit this issue. If you begin with the survivors, you have the best opportunity to open it up to reconciliation, mutual understanding. I have seen efforts made here in my own country, coming from the South, where we have had more dialogue on race relations. At times, of course, it's not always one where there's mutual agreement, but nevertheless, you have to start that uncomfortable dialogue and move forward, and you will see that it's much more liberating to know the truth. It just seems to be that we don't really want to know those things that are so upsetting to us emotionally. I think, too, with this issue that you have to have the emotional, but also sort of the thinking side of it and the facts to drive it. So there is a lot of emotion around this, but emotion alone tends to get others who are oppositional to shut down, and they go on the defensive. And I've seen that happen over and over. So we've got to stop spinning our wheels here in memory of all of those who were victims in our past. We carry that pain and suffering with us forward, and we have to make that right today.
Well, you mentioned that we must get past politics, and I completely agree with you, Dr. Snow. And Dr. Son, you've been doing this, really. You've been trying to get past the politics, and you've been introducing theatre and performance to this issue. So how can the arts help promote understanding of the issue of comfort women and gender-based violence in general?
Theater and the arts in general are such a powerful way to be able to teach others about the history of the comfort women and to present nuanced representations of their stories and to join in helping to amplify their stories. Theater, and in particular, also in bringing together people into the same space, really allows us to start thinking about what it means to be witnesses and what it means to come together as a community and to reflect upon our own responsibility. And I think it's important that when we are dealing with this particular issue, that we understand that it's multifaceted, the ways in which the women have been advocating for redress, and that we need to think about the relation between what is seemingly in the past and ways in which the past continues to this day, ways in which structures of violence continue, ways in which women are still harmed by different institutionalized forms of violence, but also to think about ways in which we are continuing the fight to really understand this as an issue of gender-based violence. Here in Chicago, I'm involved with Can-Win, which is a local organization that supports Asian and immigrant survivors of domestic abuse and sexual violence. And they are the local organization here in Chicago that supports the global movement in support of comfort women survivors. As part of their advocacy team, we think about the connections between these different forms of violence and what it means to look to the comfort women survivors as exemplars of survivor leadership, and to continue to remember the importance of not only education, but remembrance, and how we all have a part to play in helping to bring about justice, that it is not simply in the hands of the government or the courts. It is actually in the hands of all of us.
A very powerful message there. And, well, Dr. Yamaguchi, this is one of the biggest sticking points in South Korea-Japan relations and Japan's relations with other countries as well. And then how do you think Japan should move forward? How do you think it should engage South Korea and other neighboring Asian countries, especially as China continues to grow in power in the region and with the Tokyo Olympics taking place next year?
Yes, that's a very important question, that big question. And with the Tokyo Olympics, whether it's going to be actually held is a huge question. But if it's held, I'm a bit afraid of the surge of nationalism in Japan again. Because when the anti-Korea, hate Korea campaign emerged in Japan was at the time of World Cup soccer, co-hosted by Korea and Japan. And so this kind of big sports event could be another trigger for even more nationalism. But I hope that it's not going to happen. And then with this whole comfort women issue, it's the Japanese neo-nationalist aim to make it into the purely political issue between Japan and South Korea, even though the comfort women issue is actually about many other different countries too. So I'd like to see them really, Japan especially, to engage more seriously. The opposition parties should really work more on it, because I haven't seen any of those in recent years, or at least much of those hasn't been happening. And then really the citizen movement is the key in Japan. And I'd like to involve many more younger people there.
And I've definitely seen more and more Japanese people taking an interest in this, and this is very encouraging. And, well, hopefully the issues will soon be resolved, especially as time is running out for the now elderly victims, with only 17 of them still being alive. Well, this is where we're going to have to wrap up the discussion. But thank you, Drs. Elizabeth Son, Tomomi Yamaguchi, and Nancy Snow, for your incredible insights today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And thank you to our viewers as well for watching. Here in South Korea, it's going to be a long weekend, so we'll be back on Tuesday, Korea time. Have a wonderful weekend wherever you are. Goodbye.